Well, welcome everyone. It's so good to be here with you. I'll give a little bit more introduction on myself in a moment, but just to get us oriented for this session, Kevin Kumashiro and I will be discussing the intersection between education and Christian nationalism. A lot happening on that front right now. And so our conversation is going to be guided primarily around three key areas. One is going to be around privatization and intersections between public and private. The second area we'll be discussing is around DEI and LGBTQ topics, particularly in light of federal policies and other actions that are targeting DEI initiatives as well as LGBTQ people. And then the third area we'll be discussing is curriculum and censorship before we move into a Q&A and discussion regarding what briefs might come out of this. NEPC does have a policy brief on Christian nationalism that is coming out in, I believe, about a month from now. And so there are other threads, though, that could be unpacked from both that memo as well as Kevin Kumashiro's excellent work that recently came out that I read through and have learned a ton from. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kevin to kick us off on introductions.
Sure. Thanks, John. And hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming to this breakout. So I'm Kevin Kumashiro, and I'm the former dean at the University of San Francisco. I'm one of the leaders of Education Deans for Justice and Equity. And I think what John and I thought we would do is each talk about like what brings us to this project. So as a way to get started. And so I'll share three things that sort of how I'm positioned and why I'm interested in this work. So one is more about personal history. So as probably many folks do have, like a personal history at the intersection of Christianity, of educational institutions, and in my case, of homophobia as well. So I do have some early experiences within educational institutions, sort of confronting the links between Christianity and homophobia. And not surprisingly, it became a big part of my research, both as a graduate student, but then also postgraduate school as I began to do some of my work. And some of my earlier books looks at the far right in general, but the Christian right in particular. And so that's sort of one way that I think about my entry point is as a personal and as a scholarly history. I think a second way that I think about what brings me to this project is that much more recently, I've been looking at the very intersectional nature of works by Christian nationalist organizations. So for example, there's the Heritage Foundation that puts out Project 2025 and also put out Project Esther. And part of me was trying to understand, well, why would Christian nationalist organizations be so interested in such a broad range of topics? Like Project 2025 covers a huge range of topics. And so that's what prompted me to look historically at what's happening in education. And so John mentioned a report. I'll be referencing my report a few times today, but I'll put a link in as soon as I finish talking. The last thing I'll say about what brings me to this project is that I'm very interested in the history that sets the stage for current legal and cultural battles, particularly within the Supreme Court, and including on cases that aren't explicitly about religion. And so I'm sure we'll be talking about that history, kind of the legal history as well. And let me toss it back to John.
Great. Thank you. Well, likewise, as I was preparing for this conversation, I was thinking about our current political moment and thinking also and reflecting on my upbringing. And in some sense, I would say the way I was raised is a microcosm for some of what we are living through, I think, as a nation around Christianity, religion, education, among other things. My parents were both born in the years following World War II. They were both influenced by the countercultural movements of the 1960s, and yet they took different paths in that countercultural embodiment, if you will. On the one hand, my father ended up marrying a woman who had been influenced in the 1970s by the charismatic Jesus movement. which then morphed into some of what was happening in the 1980s with the emergence of the Christian Coalition and the moral majority. And so I grew up in a home that was very influenced by the evangelical movement, particularly of the Pentecostal variety. Growing up, I was the way that this played out was there was a lot of fear around end times, again, to reference Kevin's report, but a lot of very potent and visceral belief in the community that I was raised in one home around things like the end of the world, the second coming of Christ, the rapture of the church, among other things. On the other hand, my father, again, my mom and dad separated at a young age. My mom took another route. She married a man who was raised by two college professors. And I would say in some ways, this home embodied the epitome of sort of mid 1920s progressivism that was reacting to the fundamentalism of the early 1920s around the Scopes trial and whatnot. For me, it was very difficult navigating these two worlds between my fundamentalist oriented family and my more progressive oriented family. On the one hand, my fundamentalist oriented family were certainly open about scapegoating particular groups of people, including my other set of parents. And we see scapegoating happening today in popular discourse on this topic. But on the other hand, I had this perception in my more progressive oriented home that there was hostility toward religion. And I, as a young man in my adolescence, became, as I look at it now, radicalized by my father's version of Christianity. And so there were lots of tensions in my more progressive oriented home around my radicalization into what was at the time the early years of what's called the New Apostolic Reformation. I went off to study to become a minister after high school at a Bible college. At that school, I was, at the time, I thought it was helpful for me, but I was subjecting myself to what some would now refer to as conversion therapies and conversion practices. As a result of my own emerging, what I would have said at the time was same-sex attraction. I would not have been willing to assign an identity label to myself, but I could think about my own emerging identity in behavioral terms. With that being said, it informs a lot of what I think about now around religion, Christian nationalism, law and policy topics, and I'm so excited to be here with you. So thank you. I'll turn it over to you, Kevin.
Sorry. Thanks, John, for sharing. And John, you need to post, if you haven't been planning to do so, the article you shared with me that
Oh,
talks a little
sure.
bit about your journey in college.
Sure,
Uh,
sure.
so before we dive into the three topics, we thought we'd begin by defining Christian nationalism. So John, you want to begin by offering the definition?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, the way that I think about Christian nationalism, I think it's important that we separate both Christian and nationalism. And Christian embodies many different forms that have often been at odds with one another and at tension with one another, and even have motivated warfare at times of history. And I think it's important as I think about this topic to recognize that not all people who identify as Christian are Christian nationalists in the most authoritarian version of the form. But I would say that Christian nationalism in and of itself is a form of integrating both religion and politics. And it moves beyond simply someone's faith motivating their policy advocacy. It morphs into this idea of a particular form of Christianity directing policy and law. So as a result of that, I would say the nationalism angle of Christian nationalism would be painting these very clear lines of insider, outsider status, which is complicated a bit in our context because we hear rhetoric around the enemy within. And so there is that that's happening. And then the last thing I'll say about Christian nationalism before turning it back to Kevin is that I think about Christian nationalism on a scale. You have some forms of Christian nationalism that may be more seemingly benign, like a candidate placing their hand on a Bible during being sworn in for an elected office, to other more extreme reactionary forms of Christian nationalism. And I think what we're living through in some ways now is also a very strategic form of Christian nationalism, which presents a past that really not has not existed in this sort of ideal world and prefigures that for the future. So that's how I think about it.
Thanks. Yeah, let me just add a few more thoughts. I mean, for me, generally speaking, in a broad kind of overview, I think of Christian nationalism as this both an ideology and a social movement that centers a particular version of Christianity in nation building. So there's a parallel then with white nationalism and so on, right? Like it's a certain version of Christianity as a center of nation building. I think of Christian nationalism as something that predates the formation of this country. It has always been intersectional, and I know we'll talk a lot about this as well, but this version of Christianity has always been intersected with white supremacy, with male supremacy, with US supremacy and exceptionalism. And over time, one of the arguments I try to make in some of my writings is that Christian nationalism has become increasingly regressive over time, largely when it felt that its dominant status is being threatened. And then I'll end with just a few statistics. I mean, here I draw on Pew's 2022 study and the Public Religion Research Institute's 2025 study. This is all cited in my report, but I'll just highlight a few interesting statistics from these surveys. While white supremacy is central to the ideology of Christian nationalism, at least as it plays out in the United States today, it's important to first recognize that there's lots of racialized groups that embrace Christian nationalist views. So according to these studies, for example, Black people were more likely to hold Christian nationalist beliefs than any other group. Hispanic or Latinx Protestants were the group with the largest growth in support for Christian nationalism in recent years. And although white evangelicals were far more likely to support Trump, it was Asian evangelicals who were rated as more zealous than white people in believing that Christianity is, quote, the one true faith. And then in terms of how widespread these beliefs are, some interesting statistics to me is that, it's not just Christians who embrace Christian nationalist ideas, right? It's non-Christians are also believing tenets of Christian nationalism. So, for example, about 40% of all US adults indicated that the country should be a Christian nation, and that includes 20% of non-Christians. About 50% of all adults indicated that America was God's chosen nation. About 50% indicated that the Bible should influence US law, and 25% indicated that the Bible should take priority over the will of the people. And then over 50% of all people, including over 80% of Republicans, either advocated for or at least supported some tenets of Christianity. And people who adhere to Christian nationalist views were nearly twice as likely to live in red states than in blue ones, and more than 3 times as likely to identify as Republican than as Democrat. So just a taste of sort of how widespread these ideas are. Jon.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin, for the really helpful nuance in understanding the phenomenon today. I did just post the article that I wrote on what is referred to as the New Apostolic Reformation, which is a version of Christian nationalism that emerged out of the Pentecostal and charismatic movements, which are historically have been segregated, but there's also lots of integrations of racial diversity within charismatic and Pentecostal churches. But the New Apostolic Reformation takes a more of a dominionist view about ensuring that their version of Christians are dominating the public sphere through what they would call the Seven Mountain Mandate over spheres of society such as education and religion and business and arts and media, among other areas. But before turning it back to Kevin to kick us off on the first theme of our conversation, just a reminder that the questions we're asking are how does our understanding as scholars of Christian nationalism, particularly as it intersects with education, inform some of the efforts we've seen advanced by the conservative right around topics of privatization, DEI, and LGBTQ matters, as well as curriculum and censorship? And we're going to start with privatization. I'll turn it back to Kevin.
Yeah, thank you. So the first, what we're trying to do is, understand how Christian nationalism, how what we'd like to do is sort of grapple in terms of the role of Christian nationalism in helping us to understand recent initiatives towards school privatization. And so what I'd like to do is focus my comments for a few minutes on just the last 80 years or so. So where I'll begin my story is to talk about the Supreme Court in two sets of cases. So from the late 1940s to the early 1970s, the Supreme Court made decisions around religious freedom. And some would point to these cases as some of what plants the seeds for the formation of the new Christian right, which emerges around the 1960s and is sort of the latest iteration of Christian nationalism and sort of far-right Christian organizing. But let's backtrack, right? So late 1940s to early 1970s is when the court makes a series of decisions in cases regarding religious freedom. And so we can point, for example, to the 19 this is all in my report as well, in case you're trying to be like, this is too many dates. The 1947 case is often pointed to as one of the sort of that kicks off these series of cases. This is the Everson versus Board of Education of the Township of Ewing. And then what we see is more cases like in 1962, this is the Engel case, and 1963 is the Abington case. The first was about prayer, the second was about Bible readings, and in 1971 is the Lemon case that really establishes what is considered the Lemon test for determining whether a government action violates the Establishment Clause. So here we have a series of cases regarding public schools and the role or the place or the appropriateness of religion and Christianity in particular in public schools. But then you have a second series of cases that really go from the 1970s to 80s that turns its attention not so much to Christianity in public schools, but more to what's happening in Christian schools, and in particular, whether Christian schools are engaging in racial discrimination. And so we see, for example, in the 1971, initially called Coit versus Green, but by 71, it's called the Green versus Connolly case. And this is where the Supreme Court looks at the so-called segregation academies. So these are the private or the schools that were created. These are all white private schools that were created so that parents didn't have to send their white students, their white kids into desegregating schools. And the court basically said, well, these schools are clearly engaging in racial discrimination and therefore they cannot have tax exempt status. And the battle then sort of escalates as it expands to not just K-12 private schools, but also universities as well. And the much more, I think, well-known battles were around the 1980s with the Bob Jones case. And this was finally decided in 1983 that said, yes, private universities are also included within this limitation. In other words, if you're engaging in overt racial discrimination, then you also cannot enjoy tax exempt status. So I think many folks would say that these sets of cases really set the stage for the newest iteration of Christian nationalist organizing, particularly with what we call the new Christian right that emerges simultaneous to the conservative movement in this country. And one of the things that I would point to, which I found fascinating, is, we often think of both the conservative Christian movement as well as the larger conservative movement in general as being catalyzed by abortion, like the Roe v. Wade decision in 73. But there's a lot of interesting research that tells us actually abortion didn't become a centerpiece of rightist organizing until really the late 1970s. So what was it then that was galvanizing people in the 60s and early 70s? Well, actually, a lot of it had to do with the religion cases that I just mentioned, as well as the segregation cases. So civil rights, in other words, played a central role in catalyzing what we would see as the formation of the new Christian right. Vouchers would become a major policy lever to advance some of the response, the pushback against these kinds of gains. So just as you saw folks who opposed civil rights movements using choice as a way to not have to desegregate schools, right? The argument is, well, if we just have choice programs, then schools will more organically desegregate because everyone's going to try to get into the best schools, regardless of your racial background. And so choice became one of those levers. Well, choice also becomes a lever for the Christian nationalists who are trying to push back against both desegregation and restrictions on religious practice. And so we see leaders like Jerry Falwell actually citing in their writings thinkers around choice and vouchers like Milton Friedman. And this continues more modern day with Betsy DeVos pushing for vouchers and even Project 2025 with the Heritage Foundation. The last thing I'll say is that what we see in the most recent, like last 20 years of federal court and particularly Supreme Court decisions is the culmination of this pushback. In other words, you can think of the last 80 years as sort of setting the stage for what we see now, which is the Supreme Court being able to overturn those earlier decisions. So whether we're talking about 2002, which is about vouchers, also 2017, there's a Trinity case, 2020, there's the Espinoza case, 2022, there's a Carson case. These are all scaling back the restrictions of public funds going to private schools and including religious schools. And I think that's one way that I try to understand the historical precedent to the cases that we're seeing right now. So back to Jon.
Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, for that excellent history. You took us back in detail 80 years or so. I'm going to take us back a little bit further as well, which you talk about in the court case. As we're thinking about the intersection between privatization and public education, I think it's been illuminating for me to recognize the overt nature of Christianity in colonial era schooling, which was often happening within local communities, at times within relationships with the settler colonialist churches at the time. And I find that as I've thought about the history of public education, particularly, there's this tension that I'm still sitting with that I would love for this conversation to help untangle for me, which is that common schools of the 19th century were also strongly influenced by not only this generalized Protestantism and the values of Protestantism that was inculcating students through things like the McGuffey Reader, where they're reading Calvinist doctrine and whatnot. But you also, and by the way, Calvinist doctrine is about chosenness and election of specific groups of people, which I think is relevant to elitism and power. But moving forward, there was also this tension of the common schools through the efforts of Horace Mann, who was himself a Unitarian, thinking about the school system as a place that served all students of all backgrounds. How that played out in practice is complicated, and it was not always in the most ideal way, particularly as we saw the advent of indigenous boarding schools that were forcing what some would call ethnic cleansing upon indigenous people. But you had that in relationship with then the Civil War and the Reconstruction and the incredible efforts of newly emancipated Black Americans in building up of the public education project. And so there's a lot of those tensions that are at play that then as we move into the 20th century with both the overt religious oriented of common schools plus the tensions of discrimination and bigotry and hegemony, particularly Protestant hegemony, and then the fundamentalism of the early 20th century that all came into play. And thinking about privatization in particular, my questions are about how education, both public but also private, have advanced these narratives and these paradigms that have both been emancipatory but also discriminatory. And in our current context in particular, as I think about the new Christian right and the influences in the current administration, there's a couple things that come to mind. One, we have this White House faith office that was implemented, that is led by a woman by the name of Paula White, who comes out of the charismatic tradition, would call herself, or people would call her an apostle. Whether she would say that she's part of this new apostolic reformation is hard to say, because it's a sort of a mesh network that people define these folks as, but that people don't actually define themselves as. But Paula White is influenced by this, what some would call the prosperity gospel, which is the idea that righteousness, personal righteousness, leads to financial prosperity and lots of money. And we can trace some of those themes back to Norman Vincent Peale, who influenced Donald Trump and others. And I would say that as we're seeing privatization chip away at the advances we've made in public education, we shouldn't separate some of those religio-political doctrines around money and religion that are influencing how private education is being advanced by some of these groups today. The last thing I'll say before, I'd love to hear your responses or thoughts on this, Kevin, is I'm all for being a public funds, public school guy. And at the same time, I feel like if we're going to get past this moment, we need more allies. And I think some of those allies can also come from the private sphere, particularly the private religious sphere, whether it's Catholic educators who are concerned about equity and justice, or others. But we need more allies in stopping what we're seeing happening today.
Yeah, thanks so much, John. I mean, a couple thoughts come to mind, and one is that, um, one of the things that I found fascinating as I'm trying to dive into the history of Christian nationalism in public schools is to see that some of the most forceful pushback against Christian nationalism in schools has come from Christians. And it's because like one way I try to understand the thrust of Christian nationalism is with this notion that schools need to be kind of preparing people to be Christian in the way that I think everyone should be Christian. And so it's not surprising then that you're going to see different groups struggle over what version of Christianity is being promoted by schools. And it's why, for example, when we think about, what was the example that I was going to give? Um, well, back in the mid 1800s, so like around 1860 something, there was this it was called the Christian Amendment that would have written into the Constitution the idea that the United States is a Christian nation. And some of the people who pushed back against that amendment were Christians, were people who felt like, well, which version of Christianity is going to be promoted by this Constitution? And I think the same kind of argument is made within schools, right? That because what dominated the early schools were a particular version of Protestantism, you had other Protestants as well as Catholics feeling like, well, maybe we don't want schools to be too Christian. And in fact, that's why some people would argue that the call for non-sectarianism was an attack on certain Christians, because in a way it actually was a battle between Christians trying to say, well, if we make schools non-sectarian, then it prevents that group from continuing to dominate schools as they've always dominated, right? And I think, the second thought that comes to mind as I was listening to your comments, John, is that one of the things that I think is interesting is helpful to understand is how the messaging that has been used to push forward different policy initiatives or different sort of even conversations about education, the messaging needs to be, I think, carefully analyzed for their effectiveness or lack of effectiveness. And again, I go back to the whole emergence of the new Christian right in the 1960s and 70s. One thing that I didn't mention is that a lot of Christian nationalist folks were actually pretty supportive of abortion rights, even when, in the early 1970s and 1960s. But what folks realized was that by the early 1970s, coming out and saying, I'm in favor of racial segregation didn't necessarily make you look all that great in that particular moment with the elevation of the civil rights movement. So it was a conscious decision by some leaders within Christian organizations to turn to a topic that they felt could actually mobilize the middle. And for many people, that topic was around gender, was around motherhood, and was around abortion. So a lot of these kind of policy priorities are actually political decisions that are made because they feel like that particular framing would be helpful. But since we're talking about DEI, let's go to our next topic, if that's okay, John, because our next topic is how does understanding the role of Christian nationalism help us understand recent attacks on DEI and on LGBTQ people?
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, so where to begin on this one? I would start out with the ways that LGBTQ folks, particularly the transgender community, is being targeted, echo the dehumanizing rhetoric and accompanying actions that we've seen at many parts of our nation's history. Um, and as I teach this to a class of over 50 people right now on a history of American education course, I struggle because there's part of the American project, particularly around diversity of voices and bringing together people from different cultures and backgrounds and races and religions that I am moved by. There's part of our American story that is compelling to me that I think we could build on, and at the same time not minimize or whitewash the tragic histories, some of which we're discussing. So, as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and LGBTQ topics in particular, I would say these are tightly connected with one another. And the way that they're connected is in order for our nation to have upheld the horrific institution of slavery on the continent for what, almost 300 years from the time that the colonists came to this part of the world, there were stories and there were narratives that people were buying into about other people that individuals, religious among them, bought into to devalue the humanity of the other person. And I see, for example, the rhetoric, some of which I've read around Black Americans at the time of the Civil War and leading up to it. Some of the language that's used around the demonizing and literal demonizing of Black Americans, or language around savageness of Indigenous Americans. I see some of that same language being applied, particularly today, to transgender Americans. On the furthest extreme of the Christian right, you have people who believe that if you experience some form of LGBTQ subjectivity, that you're actually infused with demonic entities. And then those individuals will promote practices to heal somebody from what they believe are satanic oppressions on a person. If I can point to one example of the way that dehumanization is happening on a stark scale today, that is one. But you heard similar rhetoric that devalued other groups of people in our nation's history. And so I would say that the other part of this that is important is to think about, especially I was compelled by Kevin's work framing the need to think about collective action and capacity building and consciousness raising. And one way that the Christian right that I've seen has been effective in promoting their agenda is by using fear about others and using scapegoating rhetoric about others to advance the Christian right movement. And I'm wrestling with, particularly around LGBTQ topics and DEI and equity for underrepresented people, how do we motivate not only people on the progressive left, but some that may be in the movable middle to recognize how The emancipation of all of us is in everyone's best interest. And I haven't yet figured out what that motivating force is that isn't based in fear. And so those are some of the thoughts I'm thinking around diversity, equity, inclusion, and LGBTQ topics. I'll turn it over to you, Kevin.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks. I'll build on what John was saying with, I have three thoughts about DEI and Christian nationalism. So my first thought is that Christian nationalism, we've both talked about how it predates the formation of the United States, that in this centuries-old tradition, at least here in North America, it's always been very intersectional. And I think I mentioned before that it's been increasingly regressive over time. So what do I mean by that? So John was mentioning that even in the colonial era, we were seeing kind of Christian nationalist thoughts. And some of the narratives we were hearing from the colonial era was that this new world was in many ways akin to the promised land. So there was something about the chosenness of this place. And that then engenders other sort of linked narratives around the chosenness or the chosen group as being highly racialized, as being gendered, and as being colonial in its role. So in other words, who's going to be saving us has always been a racialized and gendered narrative, right? And then this story becomes cyclical and increasingly regressive over time. And by that, I mean, we can look, one of the things that I focus on is these three major events that are each separated by about a century. You have the American Enlightenment, which is around the time of the American Revolution. You have Reconstruction, which follows the Civil War. And then you have the Civil Rights Movement. So they're all about 100 years apart. And each of them coincide with this regeneration, this kind of revitalization of Christian nationalism. And why? What's happening in those moments? Well, each of those moments is when racial diversity, when the role of the United States in this country, when democracy, and when sort of these ideas become animated in the consciousness and really the identity of this country. And it's being seen as displacing the centrality of certain forms of Christianity, right? Particularly certain versions of Protestantism like Calvinism. And so the response of organized Christianity to these moments in history, to these developments, is to kind of double down on what they see as the most central part of who we are as a Christian people, or for some people, a Christian nation. Hence, it's increasingly racial and gender regressiveness over time. A second theme that I think of regarding the relationship between Christian nationalism and DEI is where I will look more recently at the new Christian right, which emerges from the 1960s onwards, and its use of culture wars to build its base. So I said already when I was talking about abortion that there may have been an underlying policy strand that was kind of generating a lot of maybe frustration and anger and feelings of threat among Christian nationalists, like, say, the solidifying of the separation of church and state in some of the Supreme Court decisions, and then the outlawing of racial discrimination within religious schools, right, with the subsequent cases in the 1970s. Okay, but I also made the argument, right, that what the narrative that was being used publicly was actually much more around gender and abortion in the 1970s to build their base. So one of the things that I was trying to understand is, with the new Christian right, well, what are some of the culture wars that have been used very effectively to build their base over particularly the last 60 years, but really you could argue for more than that. And I would argue that there were three culture wars that were very significant. One was around gender and abortion, one was around LGBTQ plus people, and one was around immigration, all of which have long histories that predate the new Christian right. But you can see just the effectiveness of these culture wars to kind of mobilize and build a base. Let's take LGBTQ as an example. If I were to point to some policy examples, around the Cold War, you see the Lavender Scare, right? The sort of purging and the narratives around the threats posed by LGBTQ people, employees, whether that's in public sectors like the government, but also it extended to schools as well. You see efforts to erase LGBTQ existence from the curriculums, like particularly in the 1980s, but continuing today with the so-called divisive concepts. In the 1990s, you saw moves to reinforce bans on same-sex marriage. In the 2000s, you saw moves to, um, increased extracurricular activities that were explicitly anti-LGBTQ. So things like, you know how there's Day of Silence? Well, the certain groups came up with their Day of Truth to counter the Day of Silence. Or you know how you have the Gay Straight Alliance? Well, certain groups came up with something called Truth and Tolerance Clubs. So these are sort of explicitly trying to teach Christian ethics, but in extracurricular spaces. In the 2010s, you had a wave of bathroom bills. In the 2020s, you have the anti-trans bills and the attacks on trans health. So these are just some examples. One of the things that I would point out with a lot of these examples, by the way, is that they're pushed by some of the same organizations throughout time, throughout the decades. The third point I wanted to make really briefly is that Christian nationalism has a long history of engaging in what some scholars like Catherine Lugg would call a two-pronged strategy of, on the one hand, deinstitutionalization, separating from the public sector, and on the other hand, re-Christianization, making the public sector increasingly Christian. So withdrawing from and taking over are these two-pronged strategies that you can see really over 2 centuries, but particularly over the last 60 years of the new Christian right. So some examples that I would give of re-Christianization, like making schools more Christian, would be the inclusion of extracurricular things like truth and tolerance clubs, as well as the court cases around things like prayer and Bible reading, but also the exclusion of anything that's considered to be antithetical to Christian ethics. So the opt-out um, sort of option that you saw the Supreme Court rule in the Mahmoud versus Taylor case recently would be an example of that. And then deinstitutionalization, where we're trying to separate from the public sector. Examples, of course, would be vouchers for Christian schools, including Christian schools that are explicitly teaching Christian ethics or Christian sort of teachings, and also can explicitly discriminate against LGBTQ people. I have to throw out one more thing, by the way. I have here my Santa Claus mug, and it's because it was a reminder for me that I wanted to say when I was talking about vouchers, that the move towards vouchers is part of a much larger move to move away from taxes. So cutting taxes is a central strategy within the Christian right. And it actually is a central strategy among Democrats as well. I mean, among Republicans as well. So the reason I hold up my Santa Claus mug is because some of you may know that there was a strategy developed by a conservative Christian thinker who influenced the Reagan administration, and it was called the two Santa Clauses strategy. And the two Santa Clauses strategy is the idea that Democrats look like the Santa Claus because they're coming along and saying we need to fund all these social services and things like that, right? And you look like the bad guy if you say you want to cut that. And so what we need to do if we are in favor of defunding the public sector is to come up with a way to phrase that so that it actually sounds like we're giving people a gift. And saving you from the burden of paying taxes becomes the counterpart. It becomes that second Santa. And so again, I think there are these much larger initiatives that are interconnected. And part of our strategy is not just to understand the policy initiatives, but the framing behind them. Let me toss it back to Jon.
Yeah, I loved that part of your piece on Santa Claus, Kevin. I was talking with my mom yesterday and trying to explain that part to her, and I think that was brilliant. The other part of that you mentioned, which is this deinstitutionalization as well as re-Christianization, just to bring back my own experiences in this world, I saw that in the 1980s. There was a fear among the Christian right community of the government, and you had people believing that even Republicans like George Bush were in cahoots with this new world order that was going to bring upon persecution of Christians. And I lived that and saw that skepticism of the government as a child. And it's been shocking to see the re-Christianization and the movement towards infiltrating some of the more progressive dominated organizations since that time. But a couple of one other key point that I think is important around DEI and LGBTQ people in particular, I see the fundamental um, logics as about shaping people into an image that reflects primarily this idea of a white Christian nationalist past. Even if people aren't articulating that, I see that threaded throughout these movements. I even see for example, the Christian right movements I grew up in were more egalitarian, and you had more women who were in leadership positions. While that still exists, there are fewer women that you see spotlighted in some of these Christian right movements that I've been paying attention to. And then we should also consider that I think it's next week, the Supreme Court is hearing a case on conversion therapy, right here out of Colorado, which is seeking to challenge laws that prohibit conversion therapy. And I'm very concerned about how that plays out, not only in private religious schools where you have some of the most extreme practices happening that are psychologically harmful, but we also see moves in places like Texas for chaplains to be integrated within the public school system, which lends implications to those type of harmful practices happening within our public schools as well. I think that probably leads us to our next topic, Kevin, curriculum and censorship.
Yes, yes. How does understanding the role of Christian nationalism help us understand recent struggles over curriculum and censorship? Um, so I guess I have five thoughts on this. So first is I like to remind myself that curriculum has always been a central battleground for different social groups in general. So this isn't just about Christian nationalism, but Christian nationalism, of course, has seen curriculum as a central battleground. And I know that Kevin Wellner, if you were in Kevin Wellner's breakout session, he mentioned this as well a little bit in his comments, which is that we have this um, we have this history where early education, I'm sorry, he didn't say this much, but this is what I took from him. Early education in this country was very much centered on Christianity, right? The education that happened before schools were formed for many of the settlers, for many of the white Europeans, in other words, was actually what were they learning to read from? What was the central text to teach literacy? It was the Bible. And then in the colonial schools, the pre-common schools, in other words, the most common reader in these institutions, which were mostly private schools, private small schools, and tutoring, was something called the New England Primer. And then, as Jon Sawyer mentioned, in the common schools era, you then have this thing called the McGuffey Reader. And all of these are very much centered on Christianity, on Christian texts, and they're about teaching literacy as well as a Christian version of moral education. So curriculum we might see as very much a part of how we socialize new generations into this particular way of thinking about who we are as a nation. And that's why one of the reasons why the move towards non-sectarianism was seen as anti-Christian, right? That it wasn't just about freedom of religion. It was about taking away something that schools have always had, some would argue, and that it should continue to have. And as I said earlier, battles around Christianity and Christian instruction within the curriculum has not primarily been between Christians and non-Christians. That battle early on was actually between different groups of Christians who were trying to argue that your version of Christianity shouldn't be what sort of permeates all of schools, and therefore let's make schools as non-religious as we can, as non-sectarian as we can, right? Oh, that's what I was going to say. Like some of the battles around the First Amendment. You know how I was mentioning that there was this battle around the so-called Christian Amendment in the 1860s, where it was Christians who were arguing loudly that we should not have such an amendment because then it raises the question of whose Christianity is to dominate the United States. Well, the First Amendment battles around freedom of religion were also waged partly between different groups of Christians, right? People fearing that your Christianity would dominate. All right, so that kind of interreligious struggle has also long characterized education. I'm sorry, that was my third point. So my first point was curriculum has always been a central battleground. My second point is that the texts early on, the curriculum has actually essentially been religious by nature in this country. My third point is that therefore non-sectarianism can be and has been viewed as anti-Christian by certain groups. My fourth point is that for over a decade, some of the most visible battles about curriculum have been on evolution. So many people are familiar with the, what is it, 1920s Scopes trial, but in the decades to follow, you would see evolution versus science become a central battle place, but it's just worded differently. So you have struggles over things called intelligent design or equal time policies or creation science and so on, right? And it continues even to today. And my fifth point is that courts have long recognized such strategies as ultimately Christian instruction. I mean, in other words, the reason why courts have ruled against the ability to use intelligent design as a way to incorporate sort of biblical teachings within the curriculum is because they recognize that as, and they would say in their rulings, well, no, this is actually just a cover for Christian instruction. But recent decisions, this is what I'm trying to build up to, is that recent decisions are opening the gate to kind of overturn those earlier decisions and to allow Christian instruction to return into schools. So an example would be the Mahmoud case that I already mentioned, which is that gives the ability of parents to opt out of things that they believe conflicts with their religious beliefs. But so too with decisions like the Kennedy versus Bremerton decision, which was the prayer, the coach leading a prayer on the 50-yard line decision. So yeah, how do we recognize a lot of the current struggles as building on this much longer history? And how do we also understand the backdrop to some of what we might hold dear as American values? So if you think of American values as non-sectarianism or as pluralism or as diversity or as whatever, there is truth to some of the argument that education and schools have actually always been not just Christian, but Christian nationalists in their curriculum. And so how do we grapple with those kinds of contradictions? I think is some of the questions that I'm trying to grapple with myself. Let me turn it back to Jon.
Thank you. Yeah, the anti-Christian narrative that is very strong on the Christian right, even as Christians, a particular type of Christians, are gaining power and prominence, or regaining power and prominence in some sectors, is something that around curriculum and censorship, I think we need to grapple with as we are in this moment educating students who come from both progressive families, but students who also come from maybe some of the types of families or family that I grew up in one part, which is this idea of um, Christian people being the targets of discrimination. And we're seeing that type of rhetoric and belief also playing out in Supreme Court cases that are discussing the topics, particularly around LGBTQ matters, as preserving Christian religious freedom. And the the part of this for me that is um, frightening in some sense, but it's also perhaps an opportunity for us to build is how we're seeing violence in our nation coming from a lack of understanding of the worldviews that people are coming from. And I'm using right now, I'm sort of using Christian right language, so forgive me, because the worldview narrative is very much prominent in that literature. But I think there's something about that literature that it's important that we understand, which is that we human beings are fundamentally wired to move through our lives and have a sense of purpose through stories. And those stories build these worldviews. And so I do think there's some strategy today around implementing things like an executive order protecting against anti-Christian bias. I think people are intentional there. But the folks who are seeing those executive orders that come out that are just trying to live their lives like all of us, that may be Christian or not, they're influenced by those actions. And they start to think, even my non-Christian but conservative-leaning aunt and uncle, who voted for Donald Trump, are coming along to sort of the logics of Christian nationalism. And that concerns me because I think there's a way that those of us who are on the progressive left can learn from that and to do what Kevin calls this consciousness raising around equity and around pluralism, religious pluralism, and around bringing together coalitions of people who think things differently than we do. And I think LGBTQ topics are really a fundamental thing to think about because you'll have people within the Christian right who would not advocate for violence against a transgender or a person who identifies as gay or lesbian, but they are firmly believing that visibility of LGBTQ people is a sin, right? And that is their religious belief, that you can't wave a magic wand over and have somebody's mind instantaneously change on that particular topic. But if we can join together to understand how there are, um, I guess I would call it, a spectrum of how people are um, acting out what we might call homophobia or transphobia. If we can understand that spectrum, that maybe those who are saying I'd never advocate for violence against a trans or a gay person, but I still firmly believe that LGBTQ things are wrong. But if we can have conversations and dialogues with those people may be able to come on board to support policies and practices that safeguard LGBTQ students in our schools. And the last thing that I'll mention here is, we had this horrific event a couple of weeks ago. Well, there's been political violence against the left, as we know, but also we had political violence against Charlie Kirk, who was a prominent figure on the Christian right. And one of the things I paid attention to after that horrific event was the language of people that I would call more thoughtful conservatives, people, the Mitt Romney types or the Spencer Cox types in Utah. And I was hearing people say things like, we need to stop saying that language is violence. Violence is violence. And they were making that claim over and over again, saying we need to learn how to talk to each other across differences and not see language as violence. And part of that's really appealing to me, and I sympathize with. But then there's another part of me that says, well, wait a minute. I was raised reading books about the state of the afterlife for gay people. And for lack of being, I don't want to subject you all to that trauma, but there are words that students are learning about particular groups of people that are traumatizing psychologically and otherwise. And so if you're going to make the claim that words are not violence, violence is violence, which I understand what they're saying, we also need to recognize that um, that says something about the speech that is coming forward in our curriculum around both inclusion. If you're going to say that words inherently are not violent and threatening, then we should all support representation through curriculum. But another part of that is to recognize how curriculum, in my view, can actually be violent to a person's internal life, which then leads to significant life outcomes, whether it's addiction or depression or many other things. Back to you, Kevin, to close us up.
To close this up, well, I'm looking forward to our breakout conversations. I'll just add one final thought, which is to build on one thing that John was talking about, which is around like how do we come together and build kind of larger social movements. One of the things that I was so impressed by, if that's the right word, is the ability of the new Christian right to form this massive coalition. And you see the seeds of this being planted throughout the 20th century. So I point to a few examples in my report of like intentional efforts to bring people together across not just political differences, but theological differences. So we might have very, very different views of the role of humans to in the build up towards sort of the end of the world. For example, contradictory views that actually where two different groups are actually saying, no, our role is very, very different, and that end of the world is going to look very different. And yet, despite these theological divides, people have been able to come together for political purposes and arguably even across political divides. So I do think that that's something to learn from in terms of how we build a very vibrant social movement, even with these very, very big differences in belief. So yeah, that will, I guess we have one more minute. Maybe we should all just take a deep breath before we go to our our next breakout, but I know that in our
Moment of
breakout,
silence, huh?
yeah, a moment of silence. Let's all take some deep breaths. But thanks so much, everyone, for joining. And John, what a thrill to be in conversation with you on this.
Yeah, it's an honor. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah.